A very good evening to our viewers. Thank you for joining us tonight on The Agenda. My name is Toivo Jabela. Tonight, for the first time on the platform, we are welcoming the CEO of Hyphen Energy, Marco Raffinetti, to really bring us to speed as far as the work of his company in the green hydrogen space in Namibia is concerned, and related topics. Marco, thank you very much for making time. It's first time here, and we are just pleased that you really made time.
Good to be here.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. It is not an easy job. What you're doing is not an easy job, especially, I suppose, because you're a pioneer of some sort in that, especially in the Namibian context, you are a pioneer. And there's a lot of questions being asked as to whether this is a viable thing that you are doing. It's a pipe dream, a lot of skepticism, but you seem to be very determined as a company to pursue this dream. If you can tell us first and foremost, maybe give us a sense really. I like asking this question a lot of people, but you are the man now really to answer it perhaps. What green hydrogen is, first and foremost, and secondly, where do we stand now as Hyphen? Where does Hyphen stand now in its pursuit of this resource?
So thanks for the question. I think it's a good place to start the conversation this evening. I think, like with any new industry, there are always established existing players who provide services into a certain industry, and then when new technologies emerge, there's always skepticism, there's always resistance from existing incumbent players that have a vested interest in the current system and status quo remaining the same. So we're not discouraged by that. The solar industry and the wind industry went through these same questions 20 years ago, and now those two technologies are the cheapest cheapest ways to bring new energy onto the grid. The battery technology is rapidly getting cheaper and cheaper. That is probably where wind and solar was 10 years ago in terms of that evolution. So it's becoming cheaper and cheaper and cheaper as this green industrialization rollout and decarbonization of energy systems takes place. And where green hydrogen fits into that mix is there are certain sectors that simply cannot be decarbonized through what we'd call direct electrification. So the most efficient way of using wind and solar energy in an energy system is to capture that wind and solar energy and use it directly in your toaster, your kettle, to charge your car, and not to convert it into a chemical, which is what we're doing for green hydrogen. But there are certain sectors of the economy that can only be decarbonized through green hydrogen, and those are the sectors that we target specifically. Those big sectors are something like the marine shipping industry, where you're not going to have battery-powered ships running around the oceans. Around 5% of all the global CO2 emissions come from shipping that currently runs on fossil fuel. To decarbonize that sector, one needs to look at green energy solutions. And as far as we see it, we only see green hydrogen and its derivatives as being a viable way to decarbonize shipping. The same is for the steel industry, where steel is an enormous emitter of carbon. It uses effectively an enormous amount of coking coal in order to create steel, and that can be decarbonized through green hydrogen. So we see hydrogen not as being a panacea that's going to solve all the problems, but being specifically utilized in what we call hard to abate sectors, which are very, very difficult to decarbonize in any other way.
Yeah. Tell me about this green hydrogen, not green, but clean energy overall, the entire concept, whatever the type is. In an ideal world where that takes over at some stage in the future, what will that do to the world if energy is cleaner?
So I don't have the stats in the top of my mind, but the amount of carbon dioxide that's emitted into the atmosphere, it's an enormous amount. Billions of tons a year of carbon dioxide, and really that's what we're looking to replace. Also, that the fossil fuels, there's a limit to how much fossil fuels is available. So it just makes sense from long-term sustainability that we look at alternative ways of making energy. So what a decarbonized world looks like is maximizing utilization of clean technologies, which is the sun is this enormous thermonuclear reactor in the sky, and it emits an enormous amount of energy. That's what drives solar production, and that's what drives the wind energy. So all we're doing is looking to harness and capture that energy, that free energy that's made available. And it's, when you capture it, it's very, very cheap compared to burning fossil fuels. And you don't have the waste disposal challenges that you have with nuclear. So it has certain advantages, and there's also got certain disadvantages. And not all countries are created equal. So if you're in Europe, it's very hard. The sun doesn't shine in Europe. This is the middle of winter, and today I think it was 28, 29 degrees. That's a good day. That's a good summer's day in Europe. So really, it's hard for some geographies in the world to decarbonize. So they then have to import that clean energy if they want to decarbonize their energy systems. But the number of particulates in the air from carbon, from small particulates, in the country that I come from, South Africa, I think it's estimated that 50,000 people a year health is negatively affected and probably have early death linked to bad air and particulates in the air and carbon dioxide having a negative impact on health. So we don't see the carbon dioxide in the air because it's invisible, but it is having an effect on people's health, and decarbonizing those systems makes an enormous amount of sense where it's cost effective to do so.
Yeah, but in terms of climate change, I suppose it will also have a good impact.
I think the whole decarbonization journey is around two things. It's around getting sustainability of an ecological system, and it's really around reducing the amount of carbon dioxide that we put into the world. So everybody talks about this target called Net Zero 2050, which is basically we want to get to a point where we're no longer emitting new carbon into the atmosphere. So if we emit carbon, we're taking that carbon out of the atmosphere at the same time. And that's what net zero means. And then if we can get to that position, it means that you have a long-term sustainable environmental conditions for humanity, and you no longer have this rising temperatures. So one of the key challenges that Namibia faces, being I think it's one of the most arid countries in the world. Namibia is particularly exposed to the impacts of climate change and reduced rainfall. So it's trying to arrest some of those changes. So I'm not a climate change expert, but we see the challenges, and we focus on how can we, in our way, assist on achieving decarbonization in those sectors that have to be decarbonized through green hydrogen derivatives.
Walk us through the journey that Hyphen has walked in the Namibian landscape so far, those steps from where you started to where you are today.
So our journey started, I think if you look at the journey of the shareholders that comprise Hyphen, that journey started many years ago. So if you look at our controlling shareholder, Enetrag, that company was formed in the early 90s. And just as renewable energy was starting to be considered as a viable alternative to fossil fuels, and they started their first green hydrogen project in 2007. You could see 20 or 30 years ago, for those people who understand mass manufacturing and how cost curves will come down and how efficiency of technologies will improve. You could see 20 years ago that you'd get to a point where solar and wind energy would be cheaper than fossil fuels. The same is true for hydrogen. It's a lot harder because the projects need to be executed at a much bigger scale. So if you want to do a small green hydrogen project, a small wind or solar project, you can start with a few wind turbines and a few solar panels. If you want to do a green hydrogen project, you have to do it at quite a large scale. So you're talking hundreds of wind turbines and millions of solar panels. You can't start with 10s or 20s. And that really has been the challenge. So Enetrag was way ahead of the curve in terms of seeing where this technology would ultimately end up. But like with all new technologies, it's hard to see at the point when it becomes adopted as mainstream. The same could be said for the electric vehicle industry. So for a long time, there was a lot of skeptics, particularly from the existing automotive manufacturers that had a vested interest in selling what they know how to make, which is internal combustion engines. But being technology agnostic, Enetrag looked at this world and could see that in a few years, with the declining cost of renewable electricity, which is the primary input cost to making green hydrogen, that we'd get to a point where green hydrogen would be cost competitive. And we're not yet at that point. It still is more expensive, but if you project out that learning curve, green hydrogen will start to get cheaper and cheaper in the coming years, and we'll get to a point where it can compete on an equal basis with fossil fuels.
So of course, the company then came to Namibia, collaborated in this collaborating, as a matter of fact, with the state. The late president was the champion of government in that regard. What would you say his said passing has impacted your march towards what you want to achieve? Do you think that those that are remaining in the offices are still as committed and they are working closely with you to make sure that this dream is achieved?
Maybe if I could answer that question in two parts, maybe just to explain the process that resulted in me sitting in the seat here today. So I started off by talking about the early development of green hydrogen by Enetrag.
Yes.
And then on the other side, the other shareholder, Nicholas Holdings, got a long track record in doing large-scale infrastructure projects in Africa. And has been doing that for 30 odd years.
Yeah.
Myself, I've been working on the continent in various large-scale infrastructure projects for 20 odd years. And really it's taking that expertise and then combining technology with commercial skill sets and working in partnership with governments. How we were awarded the project was through a competitive tender process. So I think it was mid-2021, government issued a tender. We had already, as shareholders, started to work together, looking at Namibia as a potential place to develop large-scale green hydrogen projects. So the joint venture had already been established. The tender was then launched, and the shareholders submitted a proposal to government, along with a large number of other players, and we were successful as the successful recipient. And we were awarded in November of 2021. From there, we then engaged in a long negotiated process with government to effectively define the legal framework and agreement for how we will develop the project, which is called the Feasibility and Implementation Agreement. And that took quite a long time to develop, not because both sides weren't being diligent in trying to bring it to resolution, but this hasn't been done before. To your opening remarks, this is the first of kind project being done, and that required an enormous amount of thought to go into the design of what we call this Feasibility and Implementation Agreement, to make sure that we think through how to design that in a way that's going to be most impactful for Namibia. Yeah. So driving the socio-economic development aspects of the project is a key cornerstone of what we're looking to do. I think in terms of the way government has structured itself, I personally met, I was fortunate enough to meet President Geingob only 3 times in my life. When we awarded the concession in Davos, when we presented the project to the world, and then when we signed the FIA. So although he was the inspiration, I think, behind green hydrogen and the mastermind that launched this ambitious agenda, he established a very big organizational structure within government in order to deliver on that vision. So who we engage with is the Green Hydrogen Council, and that comprises 12 ministers and representatives from the regions. So it's a bipartisan, cross-party political structure looking at executing green hydrogen projects, and that's led by DG Kanjosi, very effectively by DG Kanjosi. And then below that sits another structure called the Green Hydrogen Program, which is, I suppose you'd call it the executive structure where the detailed work gets done, and that's led by the Green Hydrogen Commissioner, James Manyopi. So although the passing of President Geingob was deeply upsetting to all of us, and on a personal level, I really feel for his wife. And I've said this previously, it's just very sad that he never got to see the fruits of his labor and to hang up his boots and enjoy a retirement well earned after a lifetime fighting for his country. Firstly on the political front, and then on the economic front, to see his people lifted out of poverty. That for us was very, very sad. But I think the government has set a very clear policy that green hydrogen is part of its agenda, and there has been no change in policy or direction. We have continued to advance at frantic pace together with government to make this a reality, because failure is not an option. This project is so important to the country in terms of the economic impact that it can have and the benefit that it can made to the world that it's incredibly important that we're successful.
Absolutely. So then, the status currently, what would you say is the status currently?
So at the moment we are deep into engineering. So it's an incredibly complicated project, and I'd say that there's three main aspects to the project. There's, let's call it the hardcore engineering, where we need to design port infrastructure that we're doing together with Namport, electrical connections to supply excess electricity through to Nam Power, water connections. We need to have desalinated water. We can't draw water from the natural environment. In Lüderitz, it's too water strained. So it's designing desalination plants in order to be able to supply water to the project, but also to provide additional water to the town of Lüderitz, so that the increased influx of people in Lüderitz can be accommodated without straining the existing water resources.
Yeah.
And then designing the layout of solar parks, wind parks, gas pipelines, chemical production facility for the ammonia. That's the final product that we'll make and export. The safety considerations around handling what are dangerous products and need to be handled very safely. So enormous amount going into the engineering. And together with engineering goes procurement. We need to procure all this equipment. There are some service providers in Namibia, but there are no solar manufacturers, wind turbine manufacturers, electrolyzer manufacturers. So engaging with those partners is important. And then financing is a big part of my daily job. This is an enormous amount of money that needs to be raised. A project of this scale has never been executed in Namibia previously. It'll be a first of its kind.
Yeah.
And it's a complicated project in order to put that commercial structure together. Then another very important part of our project is the social and environmental aspects. So we have a large team of people on the social side looking at how do we support government in changes that will happen in the town of Lüderitz as that town grows and develops, in order to accommodate not only this industry, but oil and gas is also the oil and gas industry is also going to have a base in Lüderitz. That's a big focus, and making sure that we can achieve our goals of local employment and local procurement targets. So we are focusing extensively on assessing the current status of the skills base in the country from a human capital perspective, in terms of the people that we need to employ, and from a capacity to service us as suppliers to the contract. And then on the environmental side, it is a very sensitive area. We've done an enormous amount of work even before submitting our bid in 2021. We started doing initial assessments on the environment, understanding it is a very complicated environment. So that's broadly what we focus our attentions on. And from today, it's around a 2-year period to what we call a final investment decision. So basically, you complete all this work, you get all the funding, the technology designs, the procurement of your equipment all lined up. You say, we're now ready to start the project. We take what we call a final investment decision, and then we move from there to what's called financial close, where all the funding is then committed to the project, and you start building and constructing the project. That roughly to the implementation of the first phase, we're looking around 4 to 4.5 years from today for that first phase commissioning.
How do you raise funds for something like that? Especially again, since it's some sort of pioneering project. It's a test sort of project where you want to see if it will succeed. How do you convince any financier to put their money into something that has not been tested before in the country?
Yeah, so that's the same with any new technology. So new technologies only come to the market either because of demand or normally it's driven by demand. And in this case, the demand for green energy and decarbonization comes from countries in the northern hemisphere that need to decarbonize, have made commitments to decarbonize their energy systems, but don't have the resources to do it on their own. So if you look at a country like Germany, for example, their commitment to net zero and decarbonization is not just a commitment made by a politician, it's law. By law, they have to achieve decarbonisation, and they won't be able to achieve decarbonisation of certain of its industrial sectors without green hydrogen. So Germany and European Union have developed a policy to say we want to procure green hydrogen, and they're looking at mechanisms to drive demand in their economies. The same in Korea and Japan. Now, Korea and Japan are somewhat different to Germany. Germany and Europe. The reason why I keep on saying Germany is the largest industrial center in Europe, and therefore they've got the biggest carbon footprint that they're looking to decarbonize. So if you want to decarbonize Europe, the low-hanging fruit or the high carbon intensity country is Germany, and so that's where you start. But there are other, obviously, Europe's a large country, a large region, but there are a large number of players in Europe who are looking to decarbonize, and effectively the European Union has set this target of net zero 2030 and has identified hydrogen as a key component. Now, Europe has some ability to produce some of this product on its own. It just doesn't have enough resources. It doesn't have enough wind and solar in the right places in order to do this. So a portion of their green hydrogen needs to be imported. If you look at Korea and Japan, those are two other big global industrial powerhouses. They simply don't have any resources. Currently, they are dependent on they import all their energy needs, and to decarbonize, they would need to replace those hydrocarbon imported energy with green hydrogen. All three of those countries and regions have set up policies to drive the adoption and the utilization of green hydrogen in their economies, and are setting up mechanisms to help support that, financial support mechanisms. So, for example, in Europe, the Germans have set up something called HD Global. They've closed their first, or have announced their first projects going through that structure, where effectively you sell your product to the German government, and your German government on sells it to customers in the market. Europe's also set up something called the Hydrogen Bank to operate in a similar way, to be a middleman or a broker between the production and consumption of hydrogen. Similarly, in Korea, they are currently running procurement programs for low carbon hydrogen, and the same is expected from Japan. So, and these products, to be clear, will be more expensive than fossil fuel based hydrogen in the short term as the price curve comes down. But again, going back to our earlier conversation, the price curve, we can see the price curve coming down over time. But you wouldn't have got cheap electric cars today unless somebody had started building electric cars. The same will be for the hydrogen sector. You wouldn't have cheap wind and solar unless somebody 20 years ago had started building wind and solar parks. It always is more expensive in the beginning, and then that cost curve comes down over time.
Yeah. Speaking of raising finances, Marco, the Namibian government is sitting with a decision whether to take up the 24% equity stake into Hyphen. How much time do they have? Because this thing has been dragging on for so long, and I'm sure for planning, Hyphen would want finality in that regard, especially for a host government. What is the latest in that regard, and how much more time can Hyphen wait until this decision is made?
So the decision to take up the equity has actually been made already. So there was a legal process, what we call an exercise of the option. That option has been exercised, and we're now in the final stages of closing that equity arrangement from a timing perspective. I think what's important for Namibians to understand, because there's been a lot of confusion on this point in the market, is government is not committing at this point to building the project and the financing for building it. We effectively need to spend somewhere around 100 million euros to get the project to what we call final investment decision and financial close, and government will pay its portion of that development cost, roughly 24 million euros. And government has not needed to use any of its own money, so no Namibian taxes are going into that. Government has been given a grant by the Dutch government effectively to pay for that on their behalf. So if you look at it from a financing perspective, effectively government becomes a 24% shareholder in the project at no cost, shares the risk alongside shareholders, the other shareholders, but doesn't need to fund that itself because it's got that money via a grant. And then at the point of financial close, government will have a decision to make around what percentage of the equity would it like to keep in the project, and how much money would it like to invest. And so part of the fundraising process the government is looking at is how they would look to accommodate that. And from an investment perspective, that's the kind of investment, if I was a Namibian citizen, that's the kind of investment you want. You get, in financing terms, is what's called it's effectively a free carry. You have no downside because it's not your money, and you have 100%, it's all upside because if the project is successful, which we believe it will be, the equity in the project will be worth, will be very valuable. And at financial close, government could then say, well, we'd like to sell some of that equity to somebody else at a profit to reinvest those proceeds into the project. But those are questions that should be directed against government around how they would like to invest longer term in the project. The only commitment that government makes today is to its 24% equity and funding the share of development costs, of which they've received a complete grant from a third-party country.
Absolutely. We go for a very short break and then return with Marco Raffinetti.
Entries are now open for the second round of Republicane's Bridal Couple of the Year competition. Couples married between 1 June and 31 August have until 30 September of this year to enter the second round of the competition. Another one of the top 10 couples will be chosen from this pool to participate in the final, taking place in May 2025. To better your chance of reaching the final, enter now. To enter, simply WhatsApp #bridal2025 to 085 785 6231 and follow the on-screen instructions or scan this QR code.
We are talking green hydrogen investments by Hyphen Energy with the CEO of that entity, Marco Raffinetti. Now, Marco, let's, I know that you've addressed this before, but I think since it's your first time on the show, it's important to put this question to you around this notion within the Namibian public that somehow the agreement, I don't know the technical name of that agreement that you referred to earlier, that somehow it should be a public document, that it should be shared. And Hyphen has a different attitude towards that. If you can explain your position.
So I don't think it's necessarily that we have a different attitude. I think we have published so the agreement that you referred to is called the Feasibility and Implementation Agreement. And we have published a document that summarizes the core commercial terms and what we believe are the most important things from a Namibian perspective, from interested parties that would like to understand it. It's available on our website. We've published it. We've exposed it or disseminated that extensively on the road shows that we've done around the country. So it's freely available, and it offers a lot of information around the core essence around this. What is in the agreement. And so we think we've done more disclosure than, say, the oil and gas industry as an example. So we think we've been an exemplary citizen in terms of that regard. What I would say is that, as with all agreements, there are things that are confidential, and it's as I said in the beginning, when we developed this agreement, there was no precedent. This isn't like a copy paste from some other industry. We needed to create this ourselves, collectively, between ourselves and government. And there's lots of companies and countries in the world trying to replicate what Namibia has done. And those are competitors to Namibia. And we don't think it's in the best interest of Namibia for us to disclose as collectively to the world the detail of how we propose to make Namibia a leader in this sector and beat other countries to market. That doesn't seem like the wisest decision to make. But the core essence of how the project will be structured, the timelines, the economic benefits that will be derived, the obligations of government, the obligations of Hyphen, all of that is being clearly disclosed. I think there's a hunger for information. We understand that, but we think we've been very fair in disclosing what we think is reasonable to disclose without harming the ability of Namibia to remain as a market leader in this developing market, which is very, very competitive.
Yeah. When you say that the market is competitive, is there any country that is already producing green hydrogen at the scale that you intend to do? For example, because I know that the advanced countries that will take up much of this are those that you refer to as not having that resource that we have here. So even if they had the resources to really go for it, it's not easy. But I'm wondering whether it's a very elementary question, but is there anyone at this stage as we speak who's already producing this product, and are the ships that are already running on this product? What's the status of the world?
So I think there's two ways to break up the market. There's what we call small scale projects, like the one that Enetrag has in Germany that's been running since 2011. They supply hydrogen commingled into the natural gas grid of Germany, and they provide hydrogen to their own fuel stations for hydrogen powered vehicles. So those projects there, and there are a number of those projects around the world. There's one big one that's currently under construction that I call a Hyphen scale size project, and that's been done in Saudi Arabia. It's a project called NEOM. And effectively the difference between that project and what we're doing in Namibia and the other developers around the world is it's not exactly clear, but it would appear that Saudi Arabia has heavily subsidized the cost of that project. If you look at it externally if you externally look at that project as a financier and try and understand how it's been put together, it appears that there's a large amount of subsidization, both on the capital expenditure side of the project. That's around $8.4 billion for their first phase, also around 1 million tons, as well as on the financing side through the leverage that Saudi Arabia has. And we think it's a net good thing that Saudi Arabia has done that. It's very important because it gets the first large-scale project banked. I think Saudi Arabia and the developers of that project, Aqua and Air Products, should be given an enormous amount of credit for developing that project, because it will help to accelerate this energy transition and the utilization of green hydrogen. That project is still in construction. They're very far advanced. I think they've maybe got another year or so to get to a point where they start producing and exporting. And then on the competitor side, there's a large number of countries around the world, Chile, Australia, on the African continent, South Africa, our neighbors to the south, Mauritania, Egypt, Morocco, that are all looking to develop large-scale green hydrogen projects that are in competition to Namibia. And really it's a race between those projects to get their projects to market first. And that's the competitive dynamic I was talking about earlier, that Namibia has been a leader in terms of its what we'd call green energy diplomacy. And if you look at the relationships that under President Hage Geingob and now under President Mabumba have been able to develop on the international stage with Germany, with Belgium, with Holland, with Denmark, with Korea, with Japan. That is diplomacy that's using the engines of state to drive economic trade. Because ultimately, if you think about these large-scale green hydrogen projects, they're billions and billions of dollars. So it's not just about supplying energy to Japan. Japan as a country is going to say, do we trust our energy security on Namibia? So there's an enormous amount of trust that comes from the host nation or trust that is required in the host nation. And that's where Namibia has been absolutely outstanding in developing policies to support and advance its agenda. I mean, very clear in terms of running competitive tender processes, being very clear in terms of its strategy, not just around export of energy, but also the green industrialization strategy that sits behind the green hydrogen strategy to drive localization. We think that's very, very unique and very powerful. And what is required in order to bring about what we'd call a just energy transition. Because Namibians should benefit from the development of their natural resources.
Yeah. Speaking of that, because of course the perception in the public, and maybe it's also not just a perception, is the truth, is that of course you have these foreign players coming to extract this resource, and people wonder, for example, how much of that will be retained in the Namibian market for our own domestic use, and whether it will come slightly cheaper, because the concept is that if I live by the sea, fish ought to be a bit cheaper for me as a guy living by the sea and whatnot. So if we become this playground for this important resource, how will that benefit Namibia?
So I think this is an evolution. So the first project will be more expensive than the second project, than the third project. So costs will come down over time. So at the moment, if you're a local Namibian and you would like to buy a hydrogen-powered car versus a diesel car or a petrol car or an electric car, you're much better off buying one of the others. You know, because it's going to be more expensive to run hydrogen, and so we don't think that Namibians should be paying a premium price for a product when Namibia is not a carbon emitter. So if you look at Namibia emits something like 4 million tons of carbon. There's companies in Europe that emit probably 10 times that. Just one company. You know, some of the big carbon polluters. So Namibia doesn't really have a decarbonization problem because Namibia is has a small carbon footprint. So utilizing that green energy initially in Namibia will probably be very expensive, but localization long term must be a key driver. And where we see localization would be, there's around 10% of the electricity that we produce we can't use, just because of the way that, even on an optimized basis. Now that energy is effectively a byproduct for us in an area where you've still got people in Namibia that aren't connected to the electricity grid. Putting that energy back into the electricity grid in order to help Namibia, we see that as being the first direct benefit. If you get to the point where you've built 10 projects of a similar scale to Hyphen in Namibia, and the cost curve has come down, and now it's the same or cheaper than fossil fuels, then naturally it makes sense for Namibia to transition. So where I'd say the main benefit for Namibia in terms of the development of this industry is in job creation, local procurement, local taxes, local royalties, and revenue streams that will arise out of these industries. And because the projects are so large, the net benefits of those are very, very big. So if you look at the size of the tax base that will be created from this industry, it's going to be enormous if you consider that maybe you'll have 10 or 20 of these projects in time.
You want to create a good infrastructural ecosystem around load rates. And one of that, and you alluded to it slightly, was or is the expansion of the port there. And there's some pushback from some community members who feel that it intrudes into some important heritage spaces and whatnot. I know that there was something also this week, the National Heritage Council, I think. How is What is the status of those issues? What are you hearing? Where does it leave you with your plans?
So I think there's two issues that are being conflated. So NAM Port, the Namibian Port Authority, is looking at extending the port of Lüderitz. And that port's called Robert Harbour. And that's to expand the port of Lüderitz to cater for the growing demand for capacity within Lüderitz, within Robert Harbour, because that port is now operating at capacity. And that's to accommodate export of manganese, import of clean fuels, diesel, etc., project cargo for green hydrogen projects, and the oil and gas.
Yeah.
And that is adjacent to Shark Island. So, and naturally, Shark Island is a very important heritage site for the Nama and the Herero peoples, and needs to be treated with the relevant respect. That's getting conflated and said, well, Hyphen is doing that. Hyphen isn't doing that project. Namport is doing that project, and they're running their environmental process. And speaking to colleagues at Namport, we know that they are doing extensive investigations on what they call a heritage assessment with specialists to look at this topic very, very carefully. But I think questions around that are best directed towards Namport. Where we are looking at developing is on the other side of the bay in an area called Angra Point, which is nowhere near Shark Island. It's across the water on the other side of the bay, and actually on the other side of the headland, where the chemical production for the ammonia will be located and the vessel loading infrastructure. So we are very aware of potential heritage implications. I've personally been to Shark Island a number of times to go and try and understand that location and what happened there better. We've also aware of certain burial sites that are in and around the area, and to date, we will confirm this during the environmental study, but to date, none of those burial sites are anywhere near where we are proposing to develop. Now, that's why you do these specialist studies, to go and separate anxiety or concerns around something with facts. And we need to go and do that work on our project to ensure that there is nothing of cultural heritage sensitivity at Angra Point, the same way that Namport needs to do the same at its site.
Yeah. I mean, of course, Namibia is one of the world leaders when it comes to environmental protection. Does that make Hyphen's life a bit difficult? Because in some countries, their laws are not as strict. Investors come and they just proceed with minimal restrictions. Does it? But of course, it's a good benchmark, because once you are set up in the context of our laws here, then you know that you have really set up on a very high scale of security. But how does that help you to even be more successful in circumventing all these challenges about environmental concerns?
So I think Namibia is an outlier in terms of countries, in terms of how it respects the natural environment. So it's one of the few countries in the world where protection of the natural environment is enshrined in your constitution. Yeah. That's not common around the world. If we look at the amount of land that Namibia has under some kind of preservation, it's 44% of the entire country. If you look at the amount of land that is then constitutes national parks, I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but it's something around 20% of the entire country is national parks. So Namibia takes this very, very seriously. And I think it's hard to understand the scale of Namibia unless you've driven the country, like I know you have and I have. Yeah. It truly is enormous. So Namibia has more land under protection than all the countries in Europe other than the top four in size. You know, it's enormous. Namibia is truly done an enormous job. So we see it as a net positive that Namibia looks after the environment and has such high environmental standards, because we will only develop the project in accordance with the highest environmental standards. And that just isn't in relation to Namibian standards. We also look at the best international standards and the latest standards that are being advocated for around the world, and we're developing in accordance with those standards as well. So, and this is not something that we're now deciding to do. Before we bid for the project, we said we will only bid on this project if we will develop the project to the highest international standards. And currently the gold standard internationally is something called the performance standards, which are set out by the International Finance Corporation. And the one that's of most relevance to us is called Performance Standard 6, that deals specifically with biodiversity and the protection of ecosystems. So we are designing our project around the environmental considerations of the project site. And I think what I'd say is it is an enormous area, and only if you go there and see it do you get an appreciation of the size. So we require a very small amount of land footprint in a very large area, and we have an enormous amount of flexibility to avoid areas of high sensitivity. So when you go into the park, you'll see a lot of the environmental sensitivity is clustered around certain geological formations like Inselbergs, which are these rocky outcrops. And then you go to other areas that are less environmentally sensitive as comparison to these particular areas. So if you look at something like 1,000 different individual plant species in that area, you don't want to go to the area that's got 300 or 400 of those. You want to stay away from that. You want to go to the area that's got 1 or 2 of those and develop on those areas that are the least sensitive. And we design the project around the environment to ensure that we avoid the most sensitive areas, and we focus on limiting the absolute size of the footprint, so that if you can do something on half the land size, that's what we optimize to do. Yeah. So you'll see a lot of our engineering solutions. Our engineers sit embedded with our environmental team. They sit at the same table, because it's important that the engineer doesn't design a project in isolation of the environment. He needs to the engineers, the guys and girls that we've got working for us, they need to design the project as an integrated project. So if an engineer wants to site a wind turbine, they need to talk to the environmental team to understand the sensitivity of that particular location, and to go out and then test that by sending out specialists into the field to go look at the location where you want to locate the equipment, to ensure that your assumption that this is not an environmentally sensitive area compared to some of the other areas is actually correct. And then design and then choose, we do or we don't propose to develop in that area. So for an example, to show you the extent of the work that we've done on this, is we've laid out or mapped out 800 wind turbines. We need 600. So we're assuming that 200 of them, a quarter of the wind turbines can fall out for environmental considerations, to ensure that we've got maximum flexibility to work around the natural environment.
Wonderful. The last 2 questions. One is, how are you dealing with, how are you sort of empowering Namibian communities so that the project is not perceived to be just completely foreign? I know that you've sent some people for training abroad and whatnot. If you can expand on some of those initiatives.
So I'll tell you what we've done to date, and I'll tell you what we're proposing to do. So if you look at the composition of Hyphen today, I think we're 26 people today. We've got 2 foreigners who work for Hyphen, myself and our Chief Operating Officer. Everybody else is Namibian. Those are our engineers, our environmental team, our socio-economic development team, HR, finance, public relations, etc. We worked very, very hard to find the talent, because we committed to Namibia that we would bring in local talent. That's just the start of the journey, and words are cheap, but we think actions speak loudly. And to date, we are, from the very beginning, we've lived up to our commitments. In terms of our engagement with the local community, we've now opened up our office in Luderitz, and we've got our first 5 staff members employed in Luderitz. Windhoek will always be a satellite office of what will be the project in Luderitz. But because the project at the moment is engaging with ministers and government, and it's a lot of it's not execution, it's planning, that it's more convenient to do that out of Windhoek. But when we have thousands of people employed, those people will be employed down in the south, not in Windhoek. We've taken up offices in the old coal-fired power station, and we're looking at expanding those offices now. In terms of the work that we're doing on the socio-economic development side, at the moment we're undertaking studies together with government, the Green Hydrogen Program that we've scoped out to look at the entire skills availability across the entire country.
Yeah.
And that is across the entire country. It's not limited to a region. Our commitment is to employ Namibians, as many Namibians as we can get for the skills that we need. And mapping out that skills matrix of what we require is a complicated job, and the training that is required in order to bridge those skills gaps to ensure that we've got the right people. And some skills are shorter to train. You can train some people in 3 months for certain roles, certain very complicated roles. When it comes to the handling of ammonia and chemical engineers, where that is the most dangerous part of the project, it's probably unlikely that we're going to find Namibians because we can't sacrifice on quality and safety in order to hit numbers. So there's a very fine balance that we need to strike to ensure that we maximize local jobs, but not at the expense of safety or the successful execution of the project.
Absolutely. The last question to you, Marco, is the timelines. What can you tell us about where we are now in terms of those timelines and the date by which we could expect the first production?
Yeah, so we'd like to do first production end of 2028. That's when we'd really like to, 27, 28, somewhere in that time frame. So roughly from today, we're looking sort of 2 to 2.5 years until we start building. And that's an enormous amount of work, thousands and thousands of man hours and woman hours of work to design the project. And then it's around a 2-year construction period. And we're now looking at how do we optimize all aspects of the project to deliver within that time frame. And we're working very closely with government, because it isn't just work that Hyphen needs to do. There's certain things that government needs to do in order to facilitate the establishment of this industry. It's a new industry, and part of what government's looking at doing is what they call sectorial legislation or new legislation, like you have a Diamonds Act and a Oil and Gas Act. I think it's called the Petroleum Act. A similar act or an amendment to existing acts to provide for this industry is also being contemplated, because not everything that is required from a legal perspective is currently available in the country, because this hasn't been done before. So if we need to comply with the standard around the safe handling of ammonia, that standard doesn't exist. That needs to be created along with as part of this legislative environment. So it's an ambitious timeline, but we're up for the task, and we work night and day to make it happen. Absolutely. And as I said, failure is not an option. This is too important. And the importance is, this project will help Namibia to become a major player in helping the world decarbonize. And we've always said that's our role. We see our role as being one of the pioneers that helps to de-risk Namibia and this industry within Namibia. So a lot of our design of our project goes into how do we ensure that we can help to scale up those that come after us, because one Hyphen size project is not going to help the world achieve its decarbonization goals. We need 3,000 of these. That's what it means to decarbonize hard to abate sectors. As we discussed earlier, those very, very difficult sectors. You need 3,000 of these projects globally. That is an enormous undertaking. We can't take 50 years to do those 3,000 projects. We're going to have to accelerate that. And Namibia can potentially do maybe 50 of them. So Namibia can play a meaningful role, offsetting many, many times the amount of carbon that it puts out into the atmosphere, and can also use that to drive industrialization. Because ultimately you're going to have these very, very big, cheap power stations on your doorstep that have excess energy that you can utilize to beneficiate and grow industrialization in Namibia in a low carbon, no carbon intensive way to compete in international markets. And I think that's very, very exciting.
Absolutely. Marco, thank you for coming.
Pleasure. We'll have to do this again.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, we will come back again. That's Marco Raffinetti. He's CEO of Hyphen Energy, which is pursuing a very ambitious project here in Namibia to make this country a leading producer of green hydrogen. Thank you for watching.